Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and another card for my Easter series, even though this card technically could be anytime-ish sort of theme if you left out the eggs, but I still wanted to use this set. It was so cute. I had the idea kind of running in the back of my head. So last night I sat down and started to stamp everything out. So I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Somebody stamp set that's super cute, and I'm using almost all the images from the set. And I have a piece of Strathmore ready cut watercolor paper that comes in 5x7 pieces. So I have that in my MISTI, and then I arrange the images on the cardstock, and then I close the lid of my MISTI. This way I can stamp them multiple times because this watercolor paper is a little bit textured. So it usually takes at least 2 stampings to get everything stamped perfectly. And I'm using my VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And then after I stamp this first little cluster of images, I clean off the stamps really well so I can arrange them again on this paper. I wanted to create an entire background with all of these images. That's been very popular in card making lately. I love the look of it. Some people have been coming up with just the most amazing cards with all these like randomly stamped backgrounds, you know, and watercoloring them. And I thought I would try my hand at it. So I arranged all the stamps a second time, stamped a second time, and then finally arranged them a third time and stamped them. And that's where the hearts in the set really came in handy too, to kind of fill everything in. And then before I completely finished stamping, I pulled out the largest die from the Simon Says Basic Rectangle set. This cuts an A2 sized piece, so 4 1/4 and 5 1/2. So I laid that out to give me a visual as to where I'm going to be die cutting this because I want it to be the full size of my card. And then I use those hearts again just to kind of fill in those remaining blank areas. And this is where I actually made a little bit of a goof and pressed a little too hard, but I was like, you know what? I spent all this time stamping it. I'm just going with it. So I got everything stamped. I made sure to let the ink completely dry before I went on to do any watercoloring because, you know, when you double stamp it, triple stamp it, etc., it does take longer to dry than if you just stamped it and went on. So that's also, again, something that really sucks if you go to all the effort of stamping something and then you go to start coloring and the ink starts smearing and it's like, no, I have done it. So taped this down to a hardboard. I'm just using some washi tape here because I have so many rolls of it and it works just as well, in my opinion, as painter's tape for taping down watercolor paper. And then I am using my Distress inks to watercolor this in. So I super sped this up. This is about 8 times faster than it actually took me. It took me roughly half an hour, maybe a little longer, to do this entire piece, which isn't that long in the scheme of things, but that's also because I am still impatient when it comes to watercolor. I just don't have the time to really fiddle, and that's also why I like watercolor though, because I can go a little faster, make a little more of a mess, and I feel okay with it. I don't feel like I have to be super perfect. So I did the background first, and I used tumbled glass and broken china Distress ink. I'm finding with things like this, if I do the background first, I don't feel as stressed out as I've spent, you know, when you do all of the images, you spend all this time watercoloring, and then you have to try and like painstakingly go around and watercolor in around the edges, you know, and you can make things smear and wreck things. It's frustrating for me anyway. So I've started kind of doing the backgrounds first, and it's like, okay, good. Now I can just go on and do my thing. So I did that. And then made sure to completely dry it with my heat tool. And then I went on and started watercoloring in the bunnies. And that's something I had to remind myself as I was working on this. Certain colors with Distress inks really like to travel. This applies also just any watercolor. You know, if you work in something like this, you want to make sure areas are dry before you add in more wet. You know, if my background was still wet, all these colors would be bleeding out the edges. And certain colors are more apt to do that than others. And that's where I noticed I was okay until I got to this purple. And that's when I started noticing the purple really wanted to travel. So this is where I tell everyone, like, you just need to experiment and play. Even doing something like stamp out backgrounds or just stamp out multiple images and play with it and do these sorts of things, because then you start getting used to how whatever you're using, whether it be Distress inks or watercolor paints, whatever, you get used to them and how they work. You know, how they work with certain paper, how they work with certain inks, and then how they work themselves. So this was kind of a reminder for me that certain colors really like to kind of do their own thing. So this Wilted Violet really wants to just seep out and bleed. So I had to quickly dry it between colors. And the same with pinks. Pinks, purples, and reds tend to want to do that more than other colors. It's just kind of the nature of them anyway. So even with, I was using worn lipstick and spun sugar for the little bunny's feet and the ears and all that, and same thing, the color kind of wanted to travel. So I would just go in, paint down a layer, dry it quickly, paint in the second layer. I still wasn't super particular with it. I still wanted that kind of messy look. That's the thing I'm really liking too about watercolor is you can paint on one layer and it looks okay, but then you add a second layer, add a third layer, and it really starts to look like watercolor. It just gives it that texture, and that's what I really love. So that's what I did here. I did about 2 layers on everything, or I would do 1 layer and then add a little bit more, just a little bit darker, just to give it that little extra something. And again, not super particular. I didn't worry if it did bleed out the lines too much. I would just dry it with my heat tool just to keep it from really bleeding out and looking like a hot mess. So once I did all the colors, I went in with Candied Apple to do the hearts, and that's when my camera ends up dying. But the Candied Apple especially, and I've talked about this before with people, Candied Apple is a beast of its own, with like, because it is such a red pigment. It wants to go everywhere. So you kind of need to be careful of that, not just with watercoloring, but with just stamping and sponging and all that stuff. So, but it's such a beautiful red. I love it. So after everything was completely dry, I sprayed it with my distress sprayer because I cannot resist that when it comes to distress things. I love how it reacts with water. So I sprayed it with my distress sprayer, picked it up with a paper towel so it create that fun splattery mottled look. And it did cause, especially the Candied Apple, it did cause some of the colors to run, but I was okay with that. It just kind of added to the whole look of it all and made it less perfect. So I did it once, dried it, and then I did it a second time because I wanted more splatter. So you don't get as intense of an effect with when you watercolor distress inks and then splatter them afterwards as you do with, when you're applying ink directly to paper, sponging it, etc. But you still get that effect, and I love it. It just gives it something different anyway. So I did it the 2 times, made sure it was completely dry, and then I wanted to add, of course, more splatter because I love the splatter. So I grabbed my Copic Opaque White. I've had this jar for a long time. It's starting to dry out, really. I've had it for so many years and I've used it so much, and I still have tons of it left. But I pulled some out with my brush and put it on this palette. This is an Art Impressions palette that I love because it just wipes off really easily. But I just put some of the Copic Opaque White on there, thinned it out with water, got out my splatter cubby because I cannot control the splatter no matter what I do. It goes everywhere. So I use the edge of my palette and you just flick the brush right off the edge of the palette and it creates the perfect splatter, which is still somewhat more controlled, but even with me, you can see it still goes everywhere. So I splattered the background, let it dry completely, and then I can pull off my washi tape. I pull it back against itself just like you do with painter's tape or anything when you are taping down your watercolor. I wasn't too worried about it because I'm planning on die cutting this regardless, but it helps though to make sure your panel is completely dry before you peel off any tape. If it's wet at all, the tape will pull up and tear your paper. So peeled it all off and then taped that die into place, that large rectangle die, and then run that through my die cut machine. And then I grabbed a scrap of black cardstock and I'd lined up a couple sentiments from that same Somebody stamp set onto my acrylic blocks, and I treated the black cardstock with my anti-static powder tool, and that just helps the embossing powder stick to only the stamped images or sentiments rather than anything else. And then I stamped the sentiments with Simon Says clear embossing ink, and then I'm using Detail White embossing powder, just sprinkling that over, flicking off the excess, and then I'm going to use my heat tool again to completely melt these sentiments. So once those are completely melted, I can get out my paper cutter and trim these down. And after I'd done all that, I just use my fingers to remove that residue that's left over from the anti-static powder, because you can really see it obviously on black cardstock and on dark cardstock. But I just find like rubbing my fingers back and forth across it helps clean all that up. So I trimmed everything down. And then for the main panel itself, or I went and did my card base since I had my paper cutter out. So it's just heavyweight white cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 11, scored at 5 1/2, so it'll be a top folding A2 size card. And then my main panel here, I decided I've had this white thread. It sits on my desk all the time. I don't use it that often. This used to be such a big thing, again, kind of back in the day, is adding swirls of thread to our cards. It kind of started in scrapbooking, and then all us you know, card makers took up on it. And it's not as popular as it used to be, but I still like the look of it. So I was like, you know what, I can do that. It's a nice little way to add a little something to this, but I didn't want to cover up much of all that watercoloring I did. So I just swirled the thread around my fingers, kind of fiddled with it to get it to how I wanted. And then I'm going to adhere the adhesive or the sentiment right over it with foam tape. So that way I can kind of line it up. And then once I press that down onto the watercolor panel, it will hold all that thread into place. So it just gives it that little extra something. And then I can adhere this to my card base with my ATG adhesive. So I just run that all around the edges, a little bit in the middle, and get that completely lined up to the front of my card base. And while I was doing this, I thought about stamping like the egg images on the inside with a distress ink and like really dressing out the inside, and then decided to keep it really simple since I put in so much effort on the outside of the card. But I wanted that sentiment embossed on the black because it just made it stand out a bit more. And I was looking at my sequins at this point, and I was going to add some clear sequins to this, but when I was looking at them, I came across these googly eyes because I hadn't put them away yet. And I was like, perfect, I have to add these. So these are really, really tiny googly eyes. You could definitely add larger ones, which would make them stand out a lot more. Like even here on camera, it's kind of hard to see them. But that's what I kind of like about it, is it gives it that cute little extra touch without being super obvious. But again, if you wanted it to be, you could just add larger ones. So this is where my crystal katana really came in handy, because these things are kind of a pain to use because they're so small and they're staticky and they just want to go everywhere. I had a hard time at first trying to use my fingers to pick them up. So I was like, oh my goodness. So I grabbed my little crystal katana and that worked perfectly. It was able to just grab them, stick them into place. I adhered them with my multi-medium matte adhesive, and then I could just pick them up, lay them right over the little eyes, and finish my card. So that's my card for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, I will have links below the video to my blog post, links to all the supplies used. All that information will be in the description box directly below my video, as well as on my blog, which is also linked below the video. So thank you all so much for watching, subscribing, thumbs upping, and commenting on my videos, and I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye!